Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into part 2 of Extra History series on D-Day, the Secret War. I think the last episode said this one was going to be over the British intelligence deception in handling the invasion plan. It's an incredibly awesome story, spy thriller. It's really great. I don't know how much detail they're going to go into it with this, but it really is a great story. If you ever get a chance or are trying to find something to look at, find sources on this story. It is incredible. But with all that being said, let's get into it. The Secret War.
The south of England had become a vast military camp, jam-packed with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, all planning on a trip to the Normandy beaches in the early summer. The job of the British Security Service, MI5, was to make sure that on D-Day, the Germans were looking the other way. If they failed, tens of thousands of men would die. This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. In August 1942, desperate to score a success in the face of an unending string of military setbacks and defeats, the Allies carried out a daring raid on the French port of Dieppe. But the Germans were ready for them, fortified and prepared for the attack. It was an unmitigated disaster, leaving almost 4,000 Canadians dead on the beaches. This catastrophe convinced everybody that when the real invasion of France came, the Germans must not be prepared for it, or D-Day would mean destruction. This was, of course, going to be a little tricky. By 90 days after D-Day, the US Army alone planned to have 1.2 million men with all of their equipment in France. You can't just hide that under a bit of camouflage netting. And so was born Operation Fortitude, the most ambitious deception plan in military history. The operation wouldn't pretend that there was to be no invasion. That would be impossible. Instead, their goal would be to fool the Germans about how many were coming, when they would land, and where they would land. Army groups were positioned around Britain to confuse the Germans. The British Fourth Army was stationed in Scotland, supposedly preparing to attack Norway. General George Patton became the proud commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group stationed on the English coast opposite the Pas de Calais, the closest crossing to France. The British 4th and the US 1st were somewhat unusual armies in that there were no actual people in them. They were completely fake, made up, non-existent.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys have seen the video and pictures and stuff of the, carefully crafted fake army groups that were stationed right across from the Pas de Calais. They have inflatable things, they have wooden things. It's really kind of brilliant the way that they go about it.
The Allies had no real soldiers to spare. They were all needed in France for the actual invasion. So to get the Germans to fall for this massive bluff, the film industry was called in. They created a brilliant illusion, an entire dummy army. Wooden aircraft, inflatable tanks, 250 fake landing craft. 2 fake corps headquarters were invented, pouring out a constant stream of radio drivel. At one point, King George VI even made an official inspection visit, solemnly inspecting row after row of blow-up tanks and real troops who had been bussed in for the day, all while the daily newsreel broadcast this inspection to the world. George even managed to look thoroughly impressed. And, because you might as well go big or go home, this inflatable 1st U.S. Army was presented not just as a threat, but as the threat. The primary invasion force to be launched at the Pas de Calais. The Germans already considered this to be the most likely destination for the Allied attack. Now the Allies just needed to make sure that the Germans continued to believe that. And so...
Yeah, so they're... Obviously, the most sensible place to go land for the invasion is the Pas de Calais. For a whole slew of reasons, it is the most sensible place. Well, the Germans know that, so the Germans are fortifying the Pas de Calais for an invasion, right? So the play that the Allies make here, and specifically British intelligence, is, they give to the Germans what the Germans already think. So they're basically just perpetuating the idea that the Germans already have, that the Pas-de-Calais is going to be where the invasion is coming. And because that's what the Germans already think, they basically just have to reinforce that thought process.
Was born MI5's 20 Committee, so called for the
Double
XX
cross.
Roman numerals, double cross.
Yep.
Double cross fed the Germans a constant stream of highly credible intel, a combination of utter rubbish and brilliant information delivered just too late to be useful. Back in 1939, the British had turned a German agent into a double agent. He was pretty useless, but he had told MI5 everything they needed to know about how the German Secret Service communicated with their agents. The 20 Committee used this information to create an entire network of double agents. By D-Day, Germany's entire network of spies in Britain was owned by the 20 Committee. One agent was a Catalan codenamed Garbo. Garbo created a completely fictitious network of 27 agents who bombarded the German embassy in Madrid with messages, presenting an utterly convincing and utterly false picture. The real attack, they said, would come in the Pas-de-Calais. Any other perceived invasions, such as, Normandy, whatever, those were feints. If you hear any guns or shouting over there, just relax, it's just the neighbors again, go back to bed. Garbo was good at his job.
Again, if you ever get a chance to read or study more in depth on this, it's just, it needs to be made into a spy thriller. The story is so damn good.
So good, in fact, that the Germans awarded him with the Iron Cross for his invaluable services. The danger, though, was that even if they fooled the Germans before the invasion, once the Allies landed, the deception would be over. All German military strength in France would be concentrated on Normandy, and the Allies would then, no doubt, be driven back into the sea. So, a series of new operations were concocted to convince the Germans that other invasions would follow the first all along the coast of France. Secrecy was critical. To help the invading forces, a complete photographic map of all of the beaches was needed. The RAF and USAAF ran hundreds of photographic missions, but they needed more. So the public were asked to send in all of their holiday beach photos. Then the toymaker Chad Valley was commissioned to take this intel and make a vast map of the operational area in jigsaw puzzle form for easy mobility. The jigsaw map was delivered by two men in two pieces. Neither of them knew which was the real one, and once the delivery was complete, neither was allowed to leave headquarters until D-Day was over. The British Armed Forces were obsessive about security. They arranged for 30 members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force to dress in civilian clothes and visit pubs close to where the British commandos were staying. Their job? To flirt with the men and try to get them to spill some information about their mission. To everybody's amazement and delight, the commandos kept quiet.
The British military is really kind of on the ball. They were ahead of the curve, I guess, because they had something very similar to that in World War I to get men to go out and register to join the military and to be shipped off overseas. That's kind of a pretty smart way to go about it.
MI5 still worried that the news was out, though, and that the Germans would be ready and waiting. Back in 1942, the crossword in the Daily Telegraph newspaper had included a clue answered by the word Dieppe, just one day before the Dieppe raid had taken place. Worrisome.
What?
And now, on May 2nd, in the same crossword section came the clue, one of the U.S., and the answer was Utah, the code name for one of the beaches the Americans were to land on. Then, on the 22nd of May, came the answer Omaha, another beach. And then later, Mulberry and Overlord and Neptune, all code words for various D-Day operations. Finally, MI5 descended in a fury upon Leonard Daw, the schoolmaster who wrote these crosswords. Turns out that it was all just an extraordinary series of coincidences. But the big question remained.
That's wild. That's wild. I did not know that part of it. That's crazy that was just coincidence.
Had all of this deception and secrecy worked? And how would the Allies know if it had? They needed to be able to read German communications to be sure. The Germans used an extraordinarily complex encoding system, Enigma. The codes were changed daily, and there were 159 million possible permutations. German messages should have been impossible to read, but the British thought that they could crack the code. They assembled a team of brilliant mathematicians like Alan Turing at Bletchley Park to do it. Then the Allies had a lucky break. In May of 1941, a British ship forced a German U-boat to the surface. The Germans abandoned their sinking craft, but in the final moment, the British sailors managed to board and capture the most unimaginable treasure: a completely intact code machine and code books. Soon, and for much of the rest of the war, the British were routinely reading German messages.
So, do they ever break the German code if they don't find the code machine and code book? Do y'all think that they are able to break it? Because I know that there are a lot of historians that think that this really, really drastically changed the direction of the war. Maybe not as far as who was going to win, but certainly the speed at which that end would be reached, right? So I'm curious what y'all think about whether or not they would have cracked it anyway.
One estimate has suggested that the intelligence gained from this find may have shortened the war by more than 2 years.
Yeah, there are definitely historians that lean that direction too.
It was through that intelligence that the Allies learned that the 20 Committee had been stunningly successful. When the balloon finally went up, every key German commander greeted the news of operations in Normandy as an invasion, but not the invasion. Critical German focus, men, and material remained on the Pas de Calais even after D-Day, confusing, slowing, and weakening the German response. It was little short of a miracle. And so D-Day began for the British and Canadian forces. The British beaches were called Gold and Sword, and the Canadian beach Juno. Churchill had insisted on proper names rather than silly code names, saying that no mother wanted to hear that her son had given his life at the Bunny Hug landings. The British parachute drop, despite massive confusion, achieved most objectives in the face of incredible odds. 700 men and a complete glider train of artillery were supposed to be sent to capture a critical German battery, but when all of the equipment and most of the men were lost in the landing, the 150 remaining soldiers, armed only with rifles and Sten guns, took the battery nonetheless. It's 7:25 a.m. at Sword Beach. Mine-clearing tanks thrash the sand. Sappers run beside them to disable mines and obstacles, frequently falling to enemy fire along the way. Then come tanks and flamethrowers throwing themselves at the German defenses on the dunes. And only then come the landing craft to release their cargoes of men. In the chaos, the schedule collapses in only half an hour. The beach has become a tangle of men, machinery, twisted wreckage, a chaos of dead, dying, and living. The air is filled with the roar of gunfire. Every moment is a drama of comedies, tragedies, and moments of heroism. But despite the cost, the landing at Sword was remarkably successful. By 9 p.m., many units were off the beaches and moving inland. At Juno, Canadian losses were heavier, but they soon broke through the coastal defenses, as did the British at Gold. The landing plan had worked amazingly well considering. Almost everywhere, the German coastlines had been rolled up, and the Allies had complete control of the air. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Now was the time to strike hard and fast into the interior, to exploit the Germans' shock and seize the vital objectives.
And we talked about this in the Eastern Front series that we did, but the Germans are super short on oil and fuel, and they don't, a ton of their resources are being used on the Eastern Front, which has sort of turned against them by this point. And so there's a lot going against the Germans here. But with all that being said, if the Germans had known that the Normandy landings were going to happen in Normandy, they would have, at least in my opinion, having read the stuff that I've read, I believe they pushed the Allies right back into the sea. That it's an unsuccessful landing. And I think even once the landings occur, if Hitler had allowed for his tanks to be moved, to be maneuvered towards Normandy right off the bat, they still had a chance to stop them and push them back out. But it just didn't work out.
Including the major town of Caen. There was a period of calm as men brewed up to recover from the initial assault, and then they moved inland to link up with the airborne units. Unfortunately, the beachheads behind them were a massive traffic jam. The roads were chaos, and their armor support was still fighting their way through that traffic to reach them. And the Germans continued to fight hard. Key strongpoints resisted and slowed the British and Canadian infantry's advance. At 6 p.m., a unit of the King's Shropshire Light Infantry came under heavy fire 3 miles short of Caen and dug in for the night. With little armored support, pressing the attack and capturing the town was not an option. That night, men lay across a 60-mile stretch with their weapons, peering into a darkness lit by flares, tracer, and shells. D-Day had been a remarkable success, but as elite German divisions approached, the fight for Normandy was about to begin, and it would be harder than any could imagine. Thanks again to Wargaming.
Okay, so that was Extra History's D-Day, The Secret War. This is part 2 of their series on D-Day. I will get into part 3 tomorrow. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. We're almost to 400 subscribers. I'm trying to keep pushing it. Once I get to maybe 1,000, then I think I can start putting out the, all the stuff that I want to do, where I'm putting out basically questionnaires to y'all on what videos and series and all that we do next, and y'all will be able to just vote on them. With all that being said, I'll see you guys tomorrow for part 3 of Extra History's D-Day series.